It's time for Paleo Radio, only on Secular Media Network.
You are now entering Paleo Radio.
Welcome to Paleo Radio with your hosts Jeremiah Bannister and Joe Elder.
Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of Paleo Radio. My name is Joe Elder.
I'm the trident of truth, Jeremiah Bannister.
And thank you to those people listening on Spreaker, iTunes, Secular Media Group, and always 95.3 FM, 1680 AM, WPRR, Grand Rapids.
There's a whole slew of listeners, bro.
Definitely.
A whole bunch of places all over the place that love listening to Paleo Radio.
And we thank you, and we love you for it.
We love you like crazy.
We also have a bunch of great topics tonight.
It's going to be totally awesome. And, you know, we've been kind of off the air for a little bit.
Yeah, we've
taken a little bit of a break. I think we deserved it. It was spring break. Everybody else was. Everybody else but Chris Matthews over at MSNBC. But it's kind of nice, Joe, to finally kind of be up here, sitting down, getting ready for a fantastic show.
Yeah, it is. It's nice to be back into the comfort zone. We're going to start off with breaking news that happened just a week ago, Panama Papers.
Yep, 7 things you need to know. It's by CNN. Right after that, we're going to be talking about why the banks should be broken up. And this is over at Rolling Stones magazine. Tons of love over there.
Yeah, and then after that, we're following up with a BuzzFeed article, How Black People Are Being Shut Out of America's Weed Boom by Amanda Chicago Lewis. Very well-written article. Pretty long one.
It's really long. And, you know, I'll tell you, I think this is our first BuzzFeed article, and it's our first conversation about weed.
Yeah.
On this show, I
All
think.
in one.
All in one. So, yeah, and we're going to wrap up everything with how do you change voters' minds? Have a conversation. This is over by the New York Times Magazine.
And we're going to talk about if that's actually valid or not. But first, the Panama Papers. This is out of CNN.com. 7 things to know. The International Consortium of Investigative Journalists published a massive leak of documents dubbed the Panama Papers. The ICIJ, an international coalition of media outlets investigating the trove of papers, which allegedly reveal a clandestine network involving associates from Russia's Vladimir Putin and business ties between members of FIFA's Ethics Committee and men who the United States had indicted for corruption. So there's a lot of things connected here.
Yeah, this is actually rather complex, I think. It is an intricate web of global elites. Not from the United States. There's not, and we'll discuss that later. But it's a web of international elites and large sums of money being tucked away, which is obviously in conflict with a lot of the nations that they come from. There's an interest, generally speaking, of nations to say, we'd like it if you keep your money where people can kind of know what's going on with it.
Sure.
Especially if you're talking maybe hundreds of millions or even billions of bucks.
And not just necessarily to know what's going on with it, but if you're generating your income from a certain country, you need to be paying back. That's where you're making your bread and butter. If you are an American citizen and you're making money selling to the American public, it's only right that you would have your money in America. Again, we talk about that, but that concept, you know, transcends just America's country lines. All countries feel the same way.
And can I say this before we begin, man? That FIFA, of course.
Of course.
Of course. As soon as I saw the capital letters FIFA and ethics together, I'm like, oh, look at that. It's kind of like about as predictable as the morning sun.
The more than 11 million documents, which date back 4 decades, are allegedly connected to the Panama law firm Mossack Fonseca. ICIJ reports that the firm helped establish secret shell companies and offshore accounts for global power players. ICIJ reports that the 2015 audit found that Mossack Fonseca knew the identities of the real owners of just 204 of 14,086 companies and its incorporated systems. Think about that.
That's really a neat figure.
That's amazing.
I mean, just even looking at that on the notes. I mean, people got to envision this. I've got a MacBook in front of me. I've got my notes up, and it says Panama Papers, and I'm seeing this thing, and it says Mossack Fonseca knew the identities of the real owners of just 204 of the 14,086 companies it had incorporated.
Yeah.
That's just totally crazy. And this is just an Indian Ocean archipelago, right? That's often described as a tax haven. Well, apparently. It's often described as such. It's like, well, look at these numbers. It's insane. Write these things out. 204 out of 14,086. Just look at it. It's weird.
And who's mentioned in the documents? Yeah. I mean, it's not... You would think it'd be if you're creating shell companies that are covering your money, and which are gateways to money laundering, and usually it's connected with things that are not just shading off the money you have to avoid taxes, but a lot of times it's an easy way to generate, things like illegal black market trade money into regular circulation.
I mean, what would they say? I can only imagine being in that interview and saying, how many do you know? Well, I think it's around 204. And you say, well, you don't know anything about the other ones. It's kind of an interesting fact. We really just don't know anything.
Yeah, we're not really sure who's all involved. But the papers show it. And that's the thing is this massive leak is huge. And who's mentioned in the documents? The documents reference 12 current and former world leaders, as well as 128 other politicians and public officials. In addition to allegations involving associates of Putin, the Russian's leader isn't himself mentioned by name in any other documents. In FIFA, the papers also accuse the Prime Minister of Iceland for having ties through his wife to an offshore company that were not properly disclosed.
Yeah, that guy's gone.
Oh, yeah, he's already out of
What's
there.
his name? Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson?
That's a great guess.
I'm hoping.
Yeah.
If I pronounced it wrongly, let us know.
Yeah,
but
let
I think
us know,
he's,
Iceland.
I think he's done.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure
protested.
he is. And I think he said, I'll resign. But according to Vox, and I'll just throw this in there, quote, the links to Putin are so clear that Russia's government said it was obvious the Russian leader was the main target of the Panama Papers.
Well, that's awful narcissistic of him to assume he's... I mean, just like it said, there's 128 other public officials, but obviously he's thinking it's just about him. I mean, but he's worried about his own image. But man, there's so many people involved with it. Britain, France, Australia, and Mexico have vowed investigations for possible tax evasion. Going back to Iceland, he had a spokesperson say it was a holding company for his wife's assets, enjoying no tax advantages, and was created to avoid conflicts of interest in Iceland.
Yeah. Because you got, what was it altogether? They said there was 57 people already linked. Also, this is to Brazil's, is it Petrobras? I think the scandal over there. Yeah, 57 people already linked to a scandal. And this is intense. This is super duper intense, and you should see the optics. There's amazing pictures of this, of the social strife that's already happening there. It's been going on because of stuff kind of related to this, exactly, in matter of fact. But now there's even more social unrest. There's a whole bunch of Chinese leaders, relatives to China's top leader, relatives to Cameron. It's interesting to see how this is playing out with a whole bunch of names.
Yeah, just to name a few specifically, I'm looking at the New York Times, and it's the Panama Papers, Here's What We Know. This was published on April 4th, so it's a little bit dated, but it does have some of the names here. President Vladimir Putin of Russia, the father of Prime Minister David Cameron of Britain, relatives of President Xi Jinping of China, and members of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo Standing Committee. Articles published by the new organizations and cooperations with the ICIJ also suggest that King Salman of Saudi Arabia, we talked about Gunnlaugsson of Iceland, President Mauricio Macri of Argentina, and also Lionel Messi, the soccer star.
Right. There was
FIFA.
What was it? Libertarian presidential candidate John McAfee. And we've talked about him before, in fact. But he summed it up nicely, I think. He said this. He said the release contained 11.5 million documents chronicling the formation and actions of 214,000 offshore companies, along with the names and manipulations of more than 14,000 clients. Among the clients are, and this is the summation, this is really good, 12 heads of state, more than 150 politicians, 29 billionaires on the Forbes list, multiple financiers of terrorism, nuclear weapons proliferators, prominent sports and entertainment figures, numerous CIA-linked companies, and dozens of banks. A whole bunch.
Yeah, oh yeah. It's a humongous connection. One thing that's interesting when looking at it, people say that there's not many Americans mentioned in there, right? And this used to be what we talked about back in the day. We actually, in pre-show, were discussing this, that the conversation used to always be tax havens, like the Cayman Islands in the U.S. But I'm looking at an article from Bloomberg.com. It's by Jesse Drucker. Andrew Penny, a managing director at Rothschild & Co., gave a talk on how the world's wealthy elite can avoid paying taxes. His message was clear. You can help your clients move their fortunes to the United States, free of taxes and hidden from their governments. Some are calling it the new Switzerland. After years of lambasting other countries for helping rich Americans hide their money offshore, the U.S. is emerging as a leading tax and secrecy haven for rich foreigners. By resisting new global disclosure standards, the U.S. is creating a hot new market, becoming the go-to place to stash foreign wealth. Everyone from London lawyers to Swiss trust companies are getting in on the act, helping the world's rich move accounts from places like the Bahamas and the British Virgin Islands to Nevada, Wyoming, and South Dakota.
It was so interesting, too, to hear this, because we talked about this right before the show, and I was wondering the same thing. I was wondering, where are the elites in this paper in the U.S.? Where are these names? And I've heard different things tossed around. British Ambassador Craig Murray, he said, unfortunately, the leakers made the dreadful mistake of turning to the Western corporate media to publicize the results, which say that they will not make available the entire cache there. But that news, that Bloomberg piece, that's from what, December?
That's actually from January of 2016.
From January 2016. And it was so interesting to hear this because all my life I grew up in a hardcore right-wing home, patriot movement type stuff. The idea of tax havens, all these names would pop up, the Virgin Islands and Swiss banks and everything else. When you said this, when you read the title, I almost didn't believe it.
Yeah.
It was so wild to even think about it because my whole life, literally my entire life, it's been a different tale. But I'm not at all surprised with the red wave that we've had in this country and the position that many of them have on taxes, that we would be fostering an environment where that thrives here.
Yeah, and when we're talking about international standards, that's the issue there is with the international standards rising, it makes the U.S. by default, by not engaging in those standards, a place where wealthy foreigners are going to look to offshore their wealth. It, by default, is becoming the place, the shell company that we never wanted, the Banana Republic, the Cayman Islands.
And look at that. We ran out of time for this segment to go over all this. If you would like to know the rest of the questions, you got to go to CNN and tell them that Paleo Radio sent you.
Love Paleo Radio? Join the club. Support our work by visiting patreon.com/Paleo Radio today.
Back to Eagle and Dragon.
If you love Paleo Radio and you want to hear more of us, you can donate to our show by going to patreon.com/Paleo Radio and checking it out.
You know, it's awesome because doing it this way, not only is it revolutionary in my opinion, but I think it's revolutionary because this is a huge deal. That going this route, where it's listener-supported, listener-funded, it entirely frees the hosts from a series of demands that people who are not in the business do not fully understand.
That's right.
But they complain about. And they say, look at the bias. Look at how these people are in the pocket. Look at how these people can't really say what they want to say because the people who own the station or who fund their shows would be hurt by that, and you simply can't do that. That kind of thing does not happen here because we rely on people just like you, and that's huge.
And think about it this way. We've said it before. It's no more than a Sunday paper. Think about how Pops used to go down and buy one. Get your Sunday paper right here at Paleo Radio.
All right. Why the banks should be broken up. And listen, if you don't go to the Rolling Stones magazine website or if you don't read it and go and check it out when you're in a bookstore, you're missing something. Especially because of this writer, Matt Taibbi. Right here, Bernie or no Bernie, Times columnist Paul Krugman is wrong about the banks. And, you know, we were saying this, Joe. This caught our attention, maybe even if only because it was kind of a jab at Krugman. And we like Krugman sometimes.
Yeah, I think he's a very smart man, obviously. But when people were talking about the 2008 crash, he thought that the banks couldn't possibly be in on it. And now the whole idea is that everybody was in on it, and it was just the most giant conspiracy ever in his mind.
So Paul Krugman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called Sanders Over the Edge. I mean, that's pretty sensational. The piece eventually devolves into a criticism of the character of Bernie Sanders. But it's his take on the causes of the 08 crash that really raises an eyebrow. And I thought this was kind of interesting, and I'm like, I didn't know if this has always been his position, if this is kind of a new thing. But Krugman argues that the banks were not, quote, at the heart of the crisis. So at bare bone, right, at the end of the story, if he were to sum it up, he'd simply say, well, I really don't believe that it was at the heart of it, the banks, the big banks.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, and he tries to do a little bit of a sly dog move here.
Because he lays it all on Countrywide Financial and Lehman Brothers.
And he also says predatory lending was largely carried out, by the smaller non-Wall Street institutions. And, the predatory lending was carried out and financially backed by the large banking institutions. There's no way it would have had the depth and the breadth that it had without the backing of the huge, too-big-to-fail banking institutions.
Well, Taibbi says this, Krugman's just wrong about this. The root problem of the 2008 crisis lay in a broad criminal fraud scheme in the mortgage markets. Real estate agents fanned out into the middle and low-income neighborhoods in huge numbers and coaxed as many people as possible into loans, whether they could afford them or not. I mean, think about that. So they're like, all right, we're going to go ahead. We're real estate agents. We're going to try to get you a home. We're going to try to get you in somewhere. And you know how they pitch this stuff. It's sentimental. It's nostalgic. And they're going to people who, knowing how wages have been stagnant for so long, these people have been dealing with difficulties for a long time, right? And that these people, that they're given this kind of hope, this idea that they're going to have a permanence, that they're going to have a place, and that this was all a lie.
Oh yeah, it was all a big lie, and I don't think everybody was in on it. I mean, it wasn't like all the real estate agents that went out there actually thought that they were part of a huge, massive bubble. It was the people that looked at it and said, there's a lot of speculation going on in mortgage industry right now. And that's something that we should be concerned with because we're seeing a lot of people, especially in real estate and housing markets, those numbers are fluctuating and going up in a way that's kind of unpredictable. That's what the problem was. But the thing is, that only was that noticeable because it was being generated by a massive engine. And that's how the banks were getting all that money back, by taking back those bad loans.
These loans, in turn, were bought up by giant financial companies on Wall Street, who chopped them up into a kind of mortgage hamburger. Out of this hamburger, they made securities, and these securities were then sold to institutional investors like pension funds, unions, insurance companies, and hedge funds. I kind of puked in my mouth when I read that.
No, it's criminal as hell. It's absolutely criminal.
The kinds of people and the families, right? The institutions that were impacted by this on a very day-to-day level, the kind of mom and pop thing, your Johnny Q. Sally Sues of the universe. These people dramatically impacted. People with very little money already. Yeah. Low income, mid income, struggling hardcore. I mean, it blows my mind.
It was a shell game. I mean, it was a game of 3-card monte with everybody's economic backing. That's exactly what happened. They made a lot of money, and the other thing is they doubled down on it because we bailed them out. So not only did they do this to the American people, I mean, think about how many people didn't get their house back. They didn't get enough money to buy a new home, but the banking institutions that orchestrated the majority of this still march on.
What's the arrest number?
0.
That's just amazing.
0. Not 1.
But once again, predictable as the morning sun.
Yeah. But the other thing, too, is you have a country like Iceland, right? When you look at what we're talking about in our previous segment, Panama Papers, he gets mentioned in that, and people are in the streets until that guy's gone. We don't have anything of the sort in the United States, especially because we have this idea that if you make a lot of money, you deserve to be untouchable almost in a way.
Yeah. Well, now we do, and this is way off topic, and I don't want to go too far with this. I just want to simply say it. I don't want to be complicit with the rest of the media that's not doing this. But you have Democracy Spring going on. That's happening, and if you don't know what that is, you need to look it up as a hashtag Democracy Spring. But going back to the article, though, the investors buying these toxic mortgage securities weren't told how risky the merchandise was. I mean, it just gets worse. Like, you already think, man, this is kind of depraved. And then you're saying, well, and we're also kind of not being honest, and we're not talking about the risk that's going into this. I mean, it's just fraud. Many thought they were investing in AAA rated real estate, when in fact they were buying up these flimsy home loans of part-time janitors, manicurists, strawberry pickers, people without ID or immigration status, and so on.
Yeah.
Just think about this for a second. I mean, that's wild, dude.
Yeah, that's how the game is played. There's not enough money. You see the boom, and honestly, a lot of people got caught in the idea of saying, hey, you just bought your home for $80,000. You've paid $20,000 of it, and you've only been there for a couple years. Your house now is worth $120,000, $40,000 more than it used to be, just because we're America's economy is great right now. Hey, God bless America. So you should refinance your home, start investing into it. Now you say you take out $20,000 in a loan to reinvest into the house, and the crash comes. Now you've paid nothing on a home that's worth $120,000. You basically, the loan you've taken out has put you down to squash, and you've lost out on your house. The bank gets that home back, they resell it again, play the same game over again.
I knew people. As you were talking, it kind of got me thinking. I know some people growing up who were involved in something that ended up being totally a fraud. It was a scheme, and it involved large amounts of money from people and investment stuff. And there were people who committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And we knew their names. We knew who they were. Some of them we'd seen. And I'm wondering, when you're talking about this, and the article goes on to say there were two major classes of victims in this scheme. There were homeowners and investors. About 5 million people went into a foreclosure after the crash, and investor losses globally ran into the trillions. And I wondered, I said, how many of those people committed suicide? How many families went through? Because that was traumatic. The family that remained because of this, and the struggles that they were already destined to go through because of the damage done. And on top of it, now they're also dealing with it. I mean, it was so difficult, so profound and emotional.
Yeah, I mean, they literally push people off their homes, bad rate deals. But again, I think that there were people that knew what was going on, but the vast majority of people thought that it was business as usual and business was good. I just have to say, it's the nature of an unregulated market. The idea of a free economic market with the dollar, when you have things like Wall Street and speculative lending and buying and purchasing, you have a whole different type of scenario there that you can't control. And you have people that, when they get too big, can game the system in a way that can screw over everybody. And this is why you need a regulated market. Those people couldn't have been gambling in people's personal assets with Glass-Steagall.
The article talks about how virtually the entire financial industry had a hand in this, saying the ratings agencies were complicit because they blessed a lot of these mortgage securities with high ratings when they knew they didn't deserve them. Companies like AIG had a role because they created a kind of pseudo-insurance for these mortgage securities that disguised the risk they posed. So you have different parts of the finance industry and really big names, right, really prominent figures that are making this, and kind of, it's lipstick on a pig.
Yeah.
They're literally concocting the colors and scheme for the makeup and saying, "Now, well, this is how it's going to work." And it seemed to work for a long time.
Yeah. And this is what Krugman is saying, is those people are predominantly the problem. Those people that were doing most of the predatory lending on a low-level scale, because that was the active, sales pitch to it. But in the article, they come back and say that he's really missing the big part, which is the role that the banks played.
Right, and you've got, J.P. Morgan, $13 billion settlement. And J.P. Morgan, they had a whistleblower, right? What was it, Elaine Fleischman? And she found herself in some seriously hot water. Goldman Sachs, $5 billion. And that was not long ago, at the writing of this. Citigroup, $7 billion. You got Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. Huge amounts of money, Joe.
Exactly, huge amounts of money. And think about it. Giant bank lends the money to the sleazy mortgage originator. They sell it. They lose the house. It goes back to the bank, and they play the game again. The banks are crucial to the scam.
Krugman's wrong.
Dead wrong.
We'll be right back.
Now back to Joe and Jeremiah.
John Mosman's on the radar, bro.
Almost to toes.
Almost to toes. Over on Facebook, I think that he has completely figured out how to resolve the GOP crack-up schism type thing that's going on at the convention, right?
Well,
that's being predicted.
And as predicted, we all knew that Kevin Sorbo had to be involved.
Well, he had to be. Yeah. As predicted, right, by the show here, there's a sticker, and I don't know if this was who made this. It's possible old J.L. Mosman made this. I think he did. It's possible, but it says Sorbo Norris, 16, former action stars kicking ass for Jesus and red-blooded Americans, and it's hilarious. We have to share it at Paleo Radio.
Yeah, it's going to be up on the site soon. Please come check it out. Great work, John Mosman.
Yeah, belly's full of giggles, bro.
Yes, definitely. Okay, next topic. How black people are being shut out of America's weed boom. Whitewashing the green rush. This is by Amanda Chicago Lewis.
You know, I wouldn't have even thought about it, Joe. I
Yeah.
mean, now, well, let me take that back. I haven't thought about it yet, about the role that black people play in the green boom that's going on.
Yeah.
This is a really cool article, and honestly, this is a really kind of eye-opening thing that I think people should really check out.
She brings up a lot of points that are worth consideration, especially with the history that America's had dating back to at least the 1970s with our war on drug policies.
And it's long.
It's very long, but so much information involved in there. We're going to skim over it, but please check it out. It's a great article. For most jobs, experience will help you get ahead. In the marijuana industry, it's not that simple. Yes, investors and state governments are eager to hire and license people with the expertise in how to cultivate, cure, trim, and process cannabis. But it can't be someone who got caught, which for the most part means it can't be someone who is black.
Mm-hmm.
Even though research shows that all races are equally likely to have broken the law by growing, smoking, or selling marijuana, black people are much more likely to have been arrested for it. Black people are also much more likely to have ended up with a criminal record because of it. In every state that has legalized medical or recreational marijuana, bans people with drug felonies from working at, owning, investing in, or sitting on the board of cannabis business. After having borne the brunt of the war on drugs, black Americans are now largely missing out on the economic opportunities created by legalization.
So, yeah, for those who think that that line was too blunt, you know, that basically blacks need not apply, go back and reread the sentence and go back and listen to the sentence that Joe said. Literally, the stuff that people would be banned from is just, it's mind-bending. There's no way. If anyone is remotely familiar with statistics regarding black people who have been arrested, right, for drug-related crimes that would qualify for this to be disqualified. It's like, oh, you qualify to be disqualified. And this is just grotesquely disproportionate. And anyone who's remotely familiar with the numbers knows it. People like Rand Paul and Cory Booker.
There's people who do definitely know about it, and they know that the war on drugs disproportionately affected black people. So naturally, when we're talking about the green rush here, where it's being legalized and people have access to it, it's just like the laws we have almost with a felon and a gun record. You can't own a gun if you're a felon. This same idea says if you have a drug felony, there's no way you're getting close to cultivating and doing anything remotely relative to marijuana operations.
You can't sit on the board. You can't invest in it? Wow.
Yeah.
That's castration.
Amanda Chicago Lewis goes on to write, nobody keeps official statistics on race and cannabis business ownership. But based on more than 150 interviews with dispensary owners, industry insiders, and salespeople who interact with a lot of pot shops, it appears that fewer than 3 dozen of the 3,200 to 3,600 storefront marijuana dispensaries in the United States are owned by black people, about 1%.
What an interesting percentage. You know, you look at it and you say the 1% is very popular in American culture. Most people, no matter what their political position is, they kind of at least generally understand what is meant by that. This is kind of like if there was the opposite 1%, like the Bizarro of Super Friends that was the opposite of Superman. If there was the opposite of that, that was, man, that is a really small number of people that even have any opportunity whatsoever in this business, that would be your figure.
honestly, it's not a very far stretch. We like to think that in our great and enlightened selves that this modern day and age is not very racist, but in turn, the idea that white people have more economic mobility is a fact. It's a mathematical, statistical, economic fact. And so when these industries boom, those people are the ones that gain access to it in the first place. Into the article, legalizing marijuana sounds revolutionary, but with every day that passes, the same class of rich white men that control all other industries are tightening their grip on this one, snatching up licenses and real estate and preparing for a windfall. First mover advantage, they call it. That means that anyone who doesn't make the risky leap to violate federal law and get involved will now miss out forever. And in a few years, the land grab is over. And the cannabis industry may become just another example of America's never-ending cycle of racially motivated economic injustices.
Which that would just be so offensive. I mean, given the history of the drug war. And
Sure.
given the fallout of the drug war, and to say, oh, and listen, this kind of thing that, we've set up these draconian laws, you have no way whatsoever, very, very, very limited, hyper-limited access to any opportunity within this thriving industry. And that's a valid point that was brought up, man. Think about very rich people. I forget the name of the host. He used to be on TV. He was really enthusiastic, he was a pretty powerful guy. And he ended up leaving the industry, and he jumped on the marijuana thing, had multi-million-dollar industry. Gary Johnson, the libertarian candidate, he had a big operation. He ended up dropping that to run for president. And you're seeing other names, they're just the top of my head, but you see other names that are really big that are getting in on this, and it is kind of... a lot of the laws, too, the advancement of legalization or decriminalization laws, it seems to be going in the direction of centralizing ownership, including means of production, into smaller, fewer and fewer hands. And those, of course, are very wealthy white dudes.
Well, and that has to do with a risk factor. And this is Lauren Vasquez, who's spent nearly a decade as a cannabis defense lawyer in California and is now the deputy director of communications at the Marijuana Policy Project. She says, quote, "It's the people who push the limits, and those people are privileged people with resources and the ability to take risks. Based on the color of your skin, the risk is exponentially different. Even if you accept the risk of getting caught, if you're a person of color, the consequences could be so much more severe. For example, although 2.5 million black people live in California, that's more than all the states that have legalized recreational marijuana combined, by the way, you don't see many of them sitting on panels at the cannabis conferences or weighing in on the latest marijuana court case in the Los Angeles Times." Which is true.
Right.
I mean, think about it.
Oh, trust me. Right. I mean, let's be real, and I know I'll get flack for it, but a lot of these boards and a lot of these dispensaries look like Bernie Sanders rallies a little bit.
I think the big thing to think about, and the way to really corral this in, is to say that we have a time frame going on here where if the legalization of marijuana happens before the decriminalization of most of the war on drugs, then we are just by default going to affect minorities in a way that most white people aren't really comprehending. I can admit myself this was a blind spot for me. I never even thought about how the war on drugs in the previous 40, 50 years were going to affect minorities now trying to get into a legalized business.
Because, and in part, because we're white guys.
For sure.
I mean, now,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a fact. Yeah, I mean, it's totally
that's true. Last time I checked, I'm white.
right. Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at you. You're pretty confident in that. But it's like racism. It's like institutional racism. It's this kind of thing that because of the past and because certain things were done and certain laws were enacted, because of that, even if there are changes, those changes aren't always just, oh, look, now it's legalized. I guess that's the only sentence that was added to the law books. There's a lot more involved in it than that says, here are exceptions to the rule.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of them. Take, for instance, David Bruno. He's the architect of the failed 2015 legislation initiative in Ohio, which, by the way, was a huge corporate swipe, and that's why it didn't pass in Ohio. We did talk about that a couple episodes ago. And it was news last fall that he had recently hired for cannabis-related companies someone who had a clean record for 20 years and experience in growing weed illegally. Both Bruno and the man that he hired were white. As for many black marijuana growers who, in part because of discriminatory policing, did not escape that era with a clean record, Bruno has little sympathy, saying, quote, "There's not going to be a clean bill of health for anyone that was active and got caught. Those things are going to happen. There's a cost of reform and revolution. We're not a nice society, and there's not going to be reparations." So apparently he thinks he's on the same playing field.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got the idea that when he was operating illegally, his chances of getting caught were just the same as anybody else's.
It's all blank slate-ish.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's how it really works.
And anytime we get into these ideas and people think, well, no, it's just because I was more sly or whatever anybody likes to think. It's just, I like to take out the die. You have a black die with white dots, a white die with black dots. And you're going to we'll say that 1 in 6 is a criminal in both groups. And you know that. You know that every time you roll that die and you see a number, a 1, that's your criminal. And you roll the white die 10 times looking for it, but you roll the black die 150. You're more likely to find that 1 out of 6 in your 150 rolls. And that's exactly how discriminatory policing works. You stop every black person on the street. Oh, man, look at the drugs you find. Well, I wonder what would happen if you stopped every white person on the street. My goodness, you'd find a drug epidemic. Oh, we have a drug epidemic here now because actually people are being caught for what they're doing.
Yeah, and you know how many people are just like the guy in this story that get busted for what is the equivalent of a couple joints? And people who smoke weed or are familiar with weed culture, that is ridiculous.
What we really need to do is focus on the real problem, which is the war on drugs. Deschedule marijuana out of being a Schedule 1 drug, and we can work at getting those convictions lifted off of the people that are in jail for nonviolent crimes.
And listen, folks, you're not going to want to go anywhere. We're talking about changing minds.
For debates, interviews, or speeches, contact paleoradioshow@gmail.com.
You love to hate 'em, you hate to love 'em. You just can't get enough of 'em, you sick freaks. Paleo Radio's on the air.
We want to thank Medical Marijuana Exchange, Secular Humanist UAF, and Chris Hitchcock for becoming the most recent followers on our Twitter page. You can come follow us at Paleo Radio Show. We would love to have you.
Absolutely. It was awesome to see those followers. And I want to say to Le Provocateur, I want to say thank you for loving our work. And I love that hashtag, education for all. Totally true.
Yeah, it's a great idea.
All right. So on to the fourth article here, the fourth block. How do you change voters' minds? Have a conversation. Going door to door, a Los Angeles-based activist group tries to reduce prejudice against transgender people. A new study finds that it works. And this is over by Benoit Denizet-Lewis at New York Times Magazine. The Human Rights Campaign released a report warning about 44 anti-transgender bills filed in 16 states. Then, last month, the North Carolina General Assembly passed a bill preventing cities and counties from enacting their own anti-discrimination legislation, stripping existing protections. It blew me away a little bit, Joe, seeing 44 anti-transgender bills filed in 16 states. That's a valiant effort. People are really trying hard.
Yeah, you'd call that a concerted effort. There's definitely been people talking behind closed doors about what they want to do, about what they would consider to be, I guess, a problem.
Yeah, and it seems like they've been working on it for a long time, kind of colluding with one another on how to best get something like this passed. Different states have tried it.
Yeah, they're playing with it, but one thing we do know is it's awful bigoted and discriminatory, and the idea that you can strip away other defenses that we've already had in place for those people, that's the thing that's the biggest problem.
Talking about a big problem, the article goes on and says, and this is all important because, according to researchers studying the issue, quote, though there is scant research on transgender prejudice, what is known suggests transgender people face widespread prejudice and discrimination.
Which, yeah, I mean, obviously, we know that. There's a high suicide rate in that community. There's also just the fact that societally we don't treat trans people like everybody else, and that just creates environments where people get treated in bad ways. I mean, if you think about it, moving a dial back, 40 years ago, the way people treated anyone who was openly gay was the same way. So I just don't think it's a far stretch for us to think that what's happened in the gay community only 20 or 30 years ago.
And that's a fact. I mean, people, I know transgender people. In fact, we're on Secular Media Group. There's a show on Secular Media Group that's hosted by a transgender activist. And so to know these people and to kind of know their lives and to hear their stories is absolutely remarkable. And it's tragic. I mean, you can't help but to cry when you hear them. And I've talked to a number of them over the years, even interviewing them for hours. But to read this statistic, the year before, a survey of more than 6,000 transgender and gender nonconforming people revealed that an astonishing 41% had tried to commit suicide. That's huge.
Yeah, it is.
41%.
Yeah. And that's honestly, that is a symptom of knowing that society has turned its back on you. I mean, when the numbers are that high, that's people that can't get help when they need help.
When they reach out to try to get help, the people end up biting them.
Yeah.
Biting them back.
Or just being indifferent. There's the video that just came out last year. There was a person who was, they were in the road, they had been hurt. I think they had been stabbed. I can't remember the entirety of the video, but this was a transgender person who had been injured on the street, and people were walking by them and not helping. The person ended up passing away with other people walking by them.
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
Like
that's devastating.
The one teenager who committed suicide just a couple of years ago, or I guess maybe not even a couple of years ago now, but because being brought for help by parents to therapists that are not there to help you navigate this in any kind of 21st century way. I'm serious.
Yeah.
And resulted in somebody committing suicide and writing a letter, posting it online before.
Yeah.
Before she killed herself.
So this junk ain't Cracker Jacks. You know what I mean? Like people die.
Yeah, this is a real thing. So when they're talking about the fact that 44 of these laws have been anti-transgender bills, that they've been filed in 16 states, that's within the cultural context of those numbers right there.
Yeah.
That 41% figure. So Dave Fleischer, he wants to change all this. And Dave Fleischer is a short, bald, gay, Jewish 61-year-old with bulging biceps and a distaste for prejudice. Fleischer's staff at the Los Angeles-based Leadership Lab, which goes door to door to reduce bias against LGBT people, with the current focus on transgender discrimination. Now, what do you think? I'm hearing and we kind of batted this around a little bit before, but you've kind of got a thing, Joe, for that whole door-to-door scheme.
I'm not for solicitation of any sort at my door for any reason if it wasn't welcomed by me. If I didn't invite the person there and they're knocking on the door to sell me anything, I just have a strict policy that I don't listen to it. I mean, the reason why, and I know a lot of people would be upset by that, because that's true. If you try to canvass at my door, I shut the door on you. But if I want to canvass or I want that, we now, especially today, have access to media in a way that you can reach people inside their home if they want to see your content. And if they don't, they can avoid it. And that's a beautiful thing, I think. I'm not saying that for this transgender issue, but hey, look, I don't want anybody to come to my house unannounced to try to talk to me about anything relative if I didn't ask them to come over.
No, I'll say it. I don't want it on this issue here because, and you'll learn in a little bit, don't judge me too quickly, this is kind of a Trojan horse for this guy. He's open to there being a whole bunch of issues going door to door. In fact, all of them. Why not? The whole enchilada.
Well, and I would say don't get so big that it would reduce your movement down to that. I mean, think about what do people say about Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses as the running jokes of them coming door to door and knocking. You know, people, stand-up comics since that's been going on have had jokes about that sort of thing. The point being that you can have everything you're even trying to say in your message get swallowed by the medium in which you're trying to present it. And going door to door, I think, is a tough sell.
It is a totally tough sell. Now, listen, I'll kind of pull the curtain aside here and let you see into my life. When Mormons come to the door, or when Jehovah's Witnesses come to the door, I'm normally pretty cool with them. You know, I know their shtick. I know what they're getting into, and I know their language. Mm-hmm. I know how to converse with them. But the political stuff, you know, or the people coming door to door to sell energy. Right?
I think it's all the same.
They're like, oh, it's all kind of the same thing. But actually, Fleischer brings up the whole idea with Mormons. He kind of cracks a joke. He says he'd like to knock on doors with a golf ball because that's what Mormons use.
Yeah, see, to me that is just that's annoying as hell.
Right.
You can annoy me out of not listening to your position.
You know, and doesn't it kind of say something like after all this time, if that's true, and I don't know how many Mormons actually use a golf ball. I don't
know if that. I was going to say it's a new one for me too.
Such things, but doesn't it kind of say something that after all this time and after all their efforts at being friendly and clean cut and everything else smelling good and whatnot, that they're so loathed that they have to rely on golf balls to hit the door to try to hope
to get you to get
to get your attention because they don't want to be too close to the door, I guess. I don't know. Like, doesn't it say something almost to this whole philosophy of, well, if you just do what the Mormons do, people will like you?
Yeah, especially because we get later into the article, we get talking about the effectiveness of such things, where people say, well, we got them out front of the door to talk to us, and then they said certain amount of things. We checked back later, and they confirmed that they still believe it. Well, here's the thing. When you show up with people that are writing a story about it, and they answer your door, and everyone's watching you, there's societal pressure to act a certain way. It's kind of like, here's the reason why. I don't think people are really as jive with people that are gay and people that are trans nearly as much as they say they were if you stopped them on the street, looked them in the eye, and said, are you for trans people? Are you okay with trans people?
Yeah, if you're sitting
or
there...
you say, are you a racist? How many people are like, yeah, man, tried and true, I'm the biggest racist you can find. People have an element of shielding when they know that they shouldn't be saying what they think. And I think you get that a lot door to door. How many people, I don't know how many people listening have tried door-to-door sales, but I've done it myself. There's a lot of people that are awfully nice, but they really want you to leave. Yeah. They really want you to leave.
Rainbow vacuums, folks.
They're nice. They're caring people. They are empathetic, but they want you to get the hell out of there, and they got to go cook dinner.
And, you know, when we were talking about this and kind of hashing over the notes, there was you were kind of describing the scenario, like if you were kind of watching this play out, and somebody behind this guy, behind Fleischer, with the clipboard, and writing it down. And jotting down, is this person kept consistent? Check. You know, and that kind of thing. What are you going to do? Oh, I remember you. Oh, I remember this controversial thing. Okay. And you just very quickly kind of flip gear and you're saying what that person wants you to say.
Yes. And I'm conceding a couple of things here for sure. One I'm conceding is a lot of those people know that their position is very questionable, and they either just don't want to debate it, or they think it's best that no one knows they actually think that. And I think that there's a lot of people that if you stop them walking down the street, they have their veil on. They have the cover on. And they, you know, it only when you get into deeper conversations with people and you can work out deeper reasoning for why they disagree with certain things, I think can you make serious change. Other than that, I think it's kind of face value.
Now, he begins with a simple question. When talking to somebody at the door, he asks, when you vote, right, on whether to, quote, include gay and transgender people in non-discrimination laws, would you be in favor or would you oppose it? And a lot of people say that they favor anti-discrimination laws. I mean, it's kind of, who's going to oppose that? I mean, other than the very devout. Those individuals will fervently oppose that. But it's kind of like saying you oppose the Patriot Act. Anybody who lived through that, try to tell people and remember what it was like to say, yeah, the Patriot Act sucks, man. People
Back
did not.
Then,
people looked at you like, what's your problem? You're not patriotic.
People said it, but they definitely got chastised for it.
I think it's kind of the same with the non-discrimination thing. Nobody wants to oppose a non-discrimination law unless you're just really hardcore about it. Fleischer is wary of what he calls the Anti-Discrimination Declaration. And that has to do with saying that you're against discrimination, and yet kind of you really flesh it out a little bit longer, it's not the case.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, where if you have, hey, I'm going to have a half-hour conversation with you, and in that half hour I'm going to peg you down, know what your reasonings are, and then break them down for you. I just don't think that's possible with the depth of human beings. I mean, I think it just requires more than that. So continuing in the article, at the Leadership Lab's 2-hour pre-canvas training that morning, volunteers were warned about fake tens, or people who think of themselves as against any discrimination, but many of them are Democrats, and many of them nonetheless can be swayed by emotion-based appeals that provoked prejudice and fear.
Yeah, and he talks about how that worked back in November with Houston, where you had a city that elects a lesbian mayor in 2009, and then it goes and it repeals the city ordinance protecting transgender people, from discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. And I guess I thought, though, and I said, can you support a lesbian mayor while not being entirely on board with every jot and tittle of the LGBT activism?
I think so, yeah. Well, I think everything's a spectrum, so of course. I think there can be people that are that way, too.
You're going to see a lot of that anyway.
I also think maybe somebody can argue this out of me, too, but I think you can dig hard enough and find somebody who is pro-LGBT rights and also racist as heck. Or you can find somebody who's not racist at all, but they're very bigoted towards LGBT rights. Point being that there's a wide berth of opinion that could be held there, so it's not a big surprise to me.
This style of activism is controversial. There was in 2014, Science published a study claiming to show that an approximately 20-minute conversation with a gay or lesbian canvasser trained by Fleischer's team could turn a gay marriage opponent into a supporter.
It's quite a claim.
It's a huge claim. But Science retracted the study 5 months later after the lead author couldn't produce his data and admitted to lying about aspects of the experiment's design. Now, this week, this is new, a new study published in Science by David Brookman, an assistant professor of political economy at Stanford, and Joshua Kalla, a graduate student in political science at Berkeley, appears to serve as vindication of Fleischer's work. Leadership Lab-trained volunteers were found to be successful at reducing transgender prejudice in front-door conversations, the effects persisting months later in follow-up surveys. And that would seem to be the only way they'd be able to know that.
Yeah, but that's also
the follow-up survey.
That's also what we get back to where I said
Right.
They show up at the door with the paper, they're writing it down, they come back 3 months later, they want to verify what you said. It's the sort of thing where human beings do this. We talk, psychology is all over this idea that people behave differently when they're being watched. And I think we all know that to be true.
Well, and it would be kind of tough because think about it. If a 20-minute conversation can have a long-lasting impact on somebody, then what about regular 15-minute conversations with people who don't believe that way?
This way
where
right back.
That's your everyday, the pool that you're swimming in, right? That cultural context that, maybe that's having an influence too. I don't know, but I don't know. It'd be hard to disentangle that. I guess I'd have to read the study. It'd be a good one to read.
I think it just comes down to how impressionable people are, and there's some that will change their mind on a whim and some that will not, and it's as easy as that.
Drives me nuts, dude. It's totally the end. I knew the music was going to come, and it did.
Yeah, we're at that place once again where we're going to have to close up the show.
Fooey patootie.
Well, thank you guys for listening. Thank you all. You can join us on social media on Facebook and Twitter at Paleo Radio Show. And you can catch me on the 25th at the Holiday Bar doing some stand-up here in Grand Rapids. It's going to be a great time.
And we're going to share our interview actually tonight, literally, as soon as we're done recording this. So we'll share it on Spreaker when it's available.
Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next week.
You've been listening to Paleo Radio, exclusively with Secular Media Group.